Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. We will be talking about stopping toxic chemical production and pollution in Los Angeles County and elsewhere with my guest, Dr. Genghmun. He is a space industry scientist who has worked on materials for spacecrafts for over 40 plus years. He has been an environmental activist for decades. He has worked for decades at a federally funded research and development center and has had many awards, including being the recipient of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics in the International Space Ops Award for Outstanding Achievement given to the U.S. Geological Survey Landsat 5 Flight Operations Anomaly Team. He is a life member of the American Physical Society and of the Mathematical Association of America. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you very much for having me on the program. The story that I'd like to talk about, I think, is important because even though it was by now 30 years ago, it's a story of what either one person or a small group can do in terms of environmental activism.
And we're going to get into that story because it's relevant to where we met recently at an event in Torrance, California, Southern California, held by the Torrance Refinery Action Alliance, which was trying to stop pollution from a Torrance refinery. But you're referring to something that you worked on over in 1999 when Dow Chemical was proposing a hazardous waste burning plant.
Yes, and the interesting thing, actually, is that the Dow Chemical plant is actually just south of the refinery. So they're both located very close to the same area. And, you know, that is something that's very true about facilities, even for different corporations, that a lot of them are in not the wealthy neighborhood or the poorer part of town or the thing that started out as a poor part of town. And so that's part of the reason that the poorer neighborhoods have a much larger environmental justice burden from pollution. And so I think that's why these stories are important.
Well, they're very important because people are affected, the environment's affected, the wildlife's affected. There are other solutions to burning toxics, putting them into the air and affecting the local neighborhoods, and not even just the local neighborhoods, but really many, many neighborhoods that can go many miles away from where these plants are proposing to do the production or are doing the production.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That's one of the reasons why air pollution is so pernicious, because it spreads out so far with the winds and everything. And we do have a South Coast Air Quality Management District, which is supposed to be regulating air toxics. But once again, they don't do everything. And the different regulatory agencies, the U.S. EPA, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, they all have their little carved out fiefdoms. And even though it's such a big problem for all of these things, so they carve it up into little pieces, the corporations take advantage of that and will parse one thing here and one thing there, so that sometimes the big picture of pollution really never gets put together.
You mentioned the Environmental Protection Agency, and in the past, they were really doing more to stop some of the pollution. With the current administration, they're allowing a lot of companies
They just announced a huge rollback. Yes, it's absolutely terrible.
Do you think that we need more regulations to stop pollution, or do we have laws on the books and simply need more enforcement?
You need both. It just came out in the last couple of days that one of the things that all large-scale facilities, including refineries, they're risky projects. I mean, you know, they can blow up if you do things wrong. Philadelphia Energy Solutions, PES, one of the largest refineries on the East Coast, blew themselves up. The whole place went boom because they didn't do it right. So it actually was a loss for the shareholders and everybody else. But the whole point, though, is that so there are regulations, how does the government, what do they look for to a refinery operator? One of the key things they look at, or they're supposed to look at, is called the risk management plan. How do you, the corporation, manage the risk to prevent the whole place from blowing up? And they're very extensive. So a bunch of years ago, the EPA did an update to the risk management plan requirements under the Biden administration to tighten the controls to ensure that risks were going to not only be managed, but actually reduced from what their current level was. And Trump just got rid of all of that in the last week or two. So that's what you can, and so one part of the answer is what's done by regulation or what's the regulators let people get away with. And then the other part, the second part, which has more to do with individual activists, is that what can an individual activist do within the context of the present regulations to ensure that they're enforced when something comes along which doesn't look like it's really very good.
What can an activist do?
What they can do is, first they can pester people, period. The mere fact that you have a group and you're consistently hammering on something's not safe, something's not good, that by itself puts the polluters and whatever, everybody on notice, including the regulators. So even though you lose the battles and win the war, the whole point is, you can lose all the battles and eventually win the war. I mean, that's the hope for a lot of environmentalist activists.
And it's not necessary for us to have all the degrees that you do, like Ph.D. in physics. You can raise some issues.
No, absolutely not. What I did was an example of what you can do with a lot of technical understanding, but it's not the only path to achieving a change.
It's also important to realize that environmentalists did get some laws passed to try and help solve some of these problems, like the National Environmental Policy Act. And what I find interesting is that you yourself read a document and appealed the process. You had to read over 106 pages.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one thing, all these documents, which I think is an important thing to note, is that when the corporations throw something into the hopper to say, oh, we'd like to do this, whatever it is, we'd like a permit to do this, whatever it is, we'd like to continue doing this, whatever it is, they always push lots and lots of paper, because it essentially is a snow job, so that to a person who's not used to looking at paper is easily intimidated. And I think one of the things that I've learned as an environmental activist is to basically say, okay, there's a lot of fluff in here that's not really that important. There's always a few sections that are important, and some are very important. And that's the whole point of environmental activism, is to basically look at enough of these things and be an activist for enough years so that you get used to the fact that you're not intimidated by, 106 pages, 1,360 pages, etc.
You did file an appeal to the proposed permit.
Correct.
Could you explain that more?
Well, I think it's more important to actually understand a little bit of the process before you get to the appeal stage, in the following sense. If the EPA and all of these regulatory agencies did their job, and if they did their job right, then they would hold the polluters to a potentially reasonable amount of pollution, or they would hold the polluters to an amount that says you got to be very careful to not do this amount of pollution. And so the first gate, if they did it right, everybody could just salute and say, it looks good to me. When they don't do it right, then an individual can say, well, wait a minute, what about this? What about that? And then the first response of the EPA could be, oh, okay, good idea. We missed that. We'll put that in, and then we're good to go. Then, if that's not sufficient, then it requires an appeal. So the whole point is it's a multi-stage process, and the regulatory agencies have many chances to do things right, but it also means they have many chances to not do things right and make it look like they're doing things right. And that's, again, another part of environmental activism, is to make that distinction.
You were successful in winning what we might say concessions, like you got the U.S. EPA to reduce some of their proposed permit pollution amounts by a factor of 8 to 30. What's 8 to 30 mean?
Well, what it means is that if you want to burn something and it has pollutants that are usually hazardous metals, that's one of the easiest things to look at any process where something is burned, because the hazardous metal, usually impurities in the feed that goes into whatever they're burning, all those atoms that are hazardous, mercury, arsenic, antimony, they go up in the air. So in that sense, to be an activist that looks at that kind of thing, that part of it is simple, because everything that goes into is stuff that comes out of, and so it's simple to do the mass control. And then the argument becomes, what is a low enough level that's somewhat acceptable compared to a level that's moderately, maybe on the hairy edge of acceptable, versus something that is should be totally unacceptable. And that's where the concessions I won, factors of 8 and 30, up to 30, was because the way the permit was written, I decided it allowed an unacceptable amount of pollution. And that's part of the details of what I could talk about what the project was and where the break point was. Where did it go? It's like the Hollywood movies. It always starts out looking reasonable, and then all of a sudden, at one point, you may not even notice it. It falls off the cliff, and that's where all the adventure starts. So the same thing here with permits, that it all looks good. Yeah, this doesn't sound too bad. And then it falls off the cliff somewhere, and often that's the needle in the haystack.
It also requires somebody with an eagle eye like you had, because you noticed that when there was a revised permit, that there was a typo between milligrams and grams that allowed over 1,000 times more barium pollution than the U.S. EPA had originally intended, and you noted that Dow did not raise the typo issue because it was in their favor.
Absolutely.
And if they had gotten that permit at that insane level, they could have sold pollution credits. So there's a lot involved there.
This is the backstory to environmental activism, is that you think you're fighting one little thing, you think like you're doing one little thing, but the backstory is, why are the corporations trying to do this in the first place? It turns out that 30 years ago, this was the beginning of cap and trade. So it took me until the project was finished where I finally realized I just didn't want the pollution because it sounded insane. But then it finally hit me at the very end after I won the concessions. And then I said, okay, the EPA is going to reissue the permit with these lower values. But I said, sort of, not part of the settlement was, why did they do this? Where did they get those insane numbers from? And that's where I was sort of apprised that this was the beginning of cap and trade, and that the EPA didn't really notice that they had done this. So when I pointed out to them, well, if this is the beginning of cap and trade, they could have, what use would they have to have a process which has a low level of pollution and a permit that allows a very high level of pollution in the permit? Because if their process is working properly, they should never get to anywhere near that point. And so that's why I asked for all these reductions, because they were not reasonable. And so finally at the very end, I realized that they could sell those pollution credits by showing once they got the permit, they were operating so far below those values, then they could accept a voluntary lower value than the permit and sell the pollution credits so that some other community could be poisoned.
Let's explain this issue of pollution credits. It basically says that a company, whether or not they're having a facility that has pollution or whether or not it's an extractive company that's mining or logging inappropriately, that if they buy credits someplace with an organization that will save a particular area, then they can go ahead and pollute because they are supposedly balancing it out by saving. But that doesn't seem to make sense. Is that still going on?
Oh, absolutely. And here's the way it's used, as far as I understand. There's air pollution, there's water pollution, there's all sorts of pollutions. The way companies do things, what it means to sell a pollution credit, is that if you're a company and you have a permit to pollute, pollute at some level, and you demonstrate to the regulatory agencies that is in excess of what you are going to hold your wonderful process to, that your process is a lot better. And then, if you then voluntarily accept restrictions far more restrictive than your permit allows, then you can sell those pollution credits. And for example, if it's air pollution, you can sell air pollution credits. And since this really was an air pollution case where they want to burn hazardous waste and stick it in the air, then what they could do is to sell those pollution credits to another company that manufactured things or did other things and were polluting and impacting the local community, and then like a paint factory or something like that. And then they could say, okay, well, if we're polluting above the allowed values, we're going to go and buy pollution credits, oodles of them, pay the money to that organization, and now we're back into conformance with our permit when you take into account pollution credits. And then that place gets all this extra air pollution, and that air pollution, actually, they get the air pollution because they bought the credits because they need them, whereas the company, in this case was Dow, didn't need them, but they could sell them for money. So that wasn't anything in excess of what they really needed, which they could have sold. They would have still polluted Torrance air, but not to the kinds of levels allowed in the permit, and it would be somewhere other place where some poor community would be the victim of all of this. So even though it was a little local problem that I was working on, it actually, when you look at the backstory of the pollution credits, it actually had a nationwide impact.
We're going to talk more about producing hazardous materials, the pollution caused, how people can fight that and try and stop that when we return in a moment with my guest, Dr. Genghmun Ng.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Dr. Genghmun Ng. He is a physicist who has worked extensively for decades in the space industry, and he is a resident of Torrance, which is in Southern California, Los Angeles County, and seems to be at the center of polluting facilities. We've been talking about how Dow was trying to develop chemicals that were causing hazardous waste. Currently, there's an ExxonMobil Torrance refinery in the area that is still causing problems.
And believe it or not, as terrible as all of that is, Torrance is a big town in the South Bay compared to the beach cities. So when they started out years ago with the oil fields before all this got built up, and that's where the refinery first came from. But the key thing here is that as bad as it is to have these industrial facilities, and there's probably others that aren't well advertised, the poorer neighborhoods like Wilmington, there's 5 refineries around Wilmington. One of them finally closed, the Phillips 66. The pollution load on the poorer neighborhoods is even more extreme. And so I think part of the idea about being an environmental activist in a wealthier neighborhood like Torrance compared to Wilmington is that what we do can help our colleagues in the poorer neighborhoods too.
It really doesn't matter if you're poor or rich. If pollution reaches you, you mentioned oil fields, and we know that oil development, particularly in the oceans, causes spills and pollution, harms the wildlife. Do we have to worry about the oil wells on land here in Los Angeles County?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. All the oil wells on land are also, they can create pollution. As a matter of fact, depending on what kind of oil well they are. Good example is that there are places where they're fracking and they get excess methane and other stuff, and they don't have anywhere to put it, so they burn it with all sorts of other things that are in that gaseous thing. There's a wonderful book called Petroleum 238 by Justin Noble, which says all that gas contains radon, which basically turns into other things that stick around like polonium and kills people. That's another whole issue.
You actually have come to the conclusion that some of the pollution, particulate matter 2.5 microns and smaller, that's 1/30th the diameter of human hair, air, about 70% worldwide coming from one source, diesel engines, including trucks and trains, actually was the root cause of your wife's cancer, which caused her death.
Yes. That is something that's very recent. She died of uterine cancer. Uterine cancer is on the rise. And it turns out this is the global problem of pollution, that I found out half a year after she died that there was a report, which is a little off topic, but pollution is pollution, that came out of New Delhi, which is very polluted. It's so polluted, it's like Beijing. It's so polluted in New Delhi that the people who were studying New Delhi air pollution were able to determine that one factor, particulate matter 2.5 microns and smaller, by itself was responsible for taking 12 years off the average New Delhi resident's lifetime. And that's comparable to the decades-old study that smoking 1 or 2 packs a day takes 13 years off an average person's lifetime, which is why the insurance company started saying, are you a smoker? So they charge you a higher premium. So the air pollution in New Delhi, it's like smoking, 1 to 2 packs a day. It's more concentrated when you smoke 1 or 2 packs a day, but you have to inhale it 24/7. And 70% of it comes from diesel trucks. And a lot of that has come out in the last 5 or 10 years, and it's still ongoing because PM 2.5 pollution is not yet controlled by the regulatory agencies in India or in America. So that is, again, another one of the new battlefronts, and it's been linked to dementia and Alzheimer's and all sorts of terrible things. So, environmental activists have lots of things to try to help fix.
I recall when I was doing anti-war demonstrations back in the 60s, 70s against the Vietnam War, that I went down to Torrance where napalm was being developed and was really causing horrific damage to the crops and the people in the Vietnam War when it was dropped, Agent Orange. This was all being produced there in your area, and of course there was also the resultant pollution in the air locally.
Yeah, but you bring up something interesting. What you brought up is that it's one thing to pollute in the process of making an industrial chemical, like in the refinery's case, gasoline and jet fuel. The chemical plant just south of Torrance Refinery, the Dow Chemical Plant, by the time I was involved in the 90s, it made styrofoam, boogie boards. Whoopee, what could be bad about that? Except now we know styrofoam, is not so good, but that's another story. And since I'm a transplant from New York, I didn't realize that during the days of Vietnam, they were the napalm. That one site made napalm for the Vietnam War for several years. They were the napalm factory. Finally, near the end, when I was fighting Dow Chemical, I asked a colleague of mine, and I said to him, I'm really worried. If I win this, Dow Chemical might come gunning after me like Karen Silkwood. They came gunning after her for which she raised issues about nuclear reactors. So he said to me, because he was a California boy, he said, hey, Dr. Eng, you don't know. They used to stand out and have demonstrators and cops cracking heads there all the time. And I said, oh, they were protesting Dow's production of napalm. And he said, that was the napalm factory for America. Oh.
I'm so glad that they haven't come after you and you are still an environmental activist looking at all these issues. I saw the march to the Torrance Refinery opposing the hydrofluorocarbons.
Hydrofluoric acid, yes.
And that's something that people aren't aware of. What is that?
That's another whole story, and that's what I've been working on with the Torrance Refinery Action Alliance for now 11 years when we first met at the 11th anniversary of the movement to ban MHF, modified hydrofluoric acid, and HF, hydrogen fluoride. This is off topic, but I can talk a few minutes about that, just in general.
All of these are really on topic because they're so related, and the issues that you have raised about people needing to pay attention what's going on, getting involved, getting active, it hasn't stopped. It's been going on for decades. I've heard about the Cancer Alley in Louisiana with all the factories down there, but it seems like Torrance seems to be Cancer Alley also.
We have a Cancer Alley in Torrance just south of the refinery, and what happened is it's called the Pueblo because there's a lot of poor people. The poorest people of Torrance live there. And what happened many decades ago, I understand, I didn't really look into it, but there, the refinery and the chemical plants basically threw so much pollution into the ground, and the groundwater seeped outside the boundary of what they owned into the homes just south of this area where the refinery and Dow Chemical were. And so what happened is many years ago, the companies know what's going on. They just don't want anybody else to know. I mean, ExxonMobil, as an example, while we were fighting HF, their internal scientists knew of CO2 being a greenhouse gas back in the early 70s, like 73 or something, right around when the EPA first started. And they basically said, wow, our product, which gets burned and gets CO2 in the air, is causing global warming. So what do we do about it? And they said, we will start funding climate change deniers all around the country. That's how they answer these things. Yes, it goes on and on.
We've talked about some of your actions decades ago. Why do you consider it relevant that people understand what happened a long time ago and what is happening now? How are they related?
What I think is, and that's why I wanted to talk about my experience with Dow Chemical, and I'd still like to say a little more about it, is that, first of all, I believe America's a great country. It's just that there are some corporate entities that are not so great. And the fact that they have some regulatory agencies, which many countries don't have, is also great. And even more so is what an individual activist or small group can actually do to petition the regulatory agencies and the government. Even if they don't win, I think it's very important that if nobody's looking, they would run roughshod more, faster, quicker, and not better. And so, in some sense, when the companies who do pollution, which they know what they're doing, they just want to keep it hidden. And so when they know somebody's looking over their shoulder, it makes them more careful. I saw that in my work as a space industry scientist, that if one of the jobs of the federally funded research and development center that I worked for was to look over the contracts to make assets, i.e. satellites, for the National Security Space Mission. And the whole point is that it's very difficult and it has to be done right. And the problem is if they cut corners and nobody's watching them, then the mission, i.e. the satellite's going to fail, even though it gets launched under the advertisement that it'll last for a long time. The trouble with those things is that the government expects them to last a long time. So if they fail, it's really bad for the national security. One of the things, I was against the war in Vietnam, too, because I thought it was a racist war. But one of the wonderful things about the satellite business was that it had very good peacetime uses. For example, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty basically said, we're going to stop building more bombers, and Russia's going to stop building more bombers. Okay, well, that's fine. But how was the treaty validated was that, well, America still wants to build new bombers, and so does Russia. What the treaty said was, since you can't have any more, both sides, Russia and America, said, okay, well, we'll destroy 10 bombers, and then we can put in 10 new ones, and we won't have any more bombers than we started out with. That's what the treaty says. Fair and good. So how do you validate that we'll destroy 10 bombers and put in 10 new ones? Was using overhead assets called satellites, and the two, Russia and America, agreed that if Russian satellites fly over America, 23,000 miles up there, we won't consider it an invasion of our airspace, and ditto for Russia would allow our satellites to go look over. And a field in America, I forgot whether it was in Arizona or somewhere, was designated as the looky-loo point for America, and there's another field, I don't know where in Russia, which was designated the looky-loo point. And so if we said, we're going to build 6 new bombers, we're going to literally cart 6 old, decrepit bombers out to this field, cut them up into pieces, leave them to rot in this open field, usually a desert, and then the Russians could look over there and say, oh, yeah, okay, you cut up 6 bombers, so now you can have 6 more. And so the wonderful thing about the National Security Space Mission, which this versus those overhead assets, was it was actually an entity that validated a peacetime treaty. So that's why I sort of loved working for my federally funded research and development center instead of working on building bombers.
Thank you so very much for your good work. I wish we had time to hear more of your stories because it's important that we understand what's happened in the past to try and do better now and in the future. I look forward to having you back to give us some updates. Thank you so very much for being my guest.
Thank you, too, for having me.
I have been speaking with Dr. Genghmun, who is a physicist and space industry scientist, and now a full-time environmental activist. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.